Hello, everyone. So my name is Aid Taylor. I work for a company called Secrutiny, and we're a long-term partner of SASIG. And we are a provider of managed security services, amongst other things. We do consultancy and engineering and all sorts of other things as well. But one of the things I really enjoy doing is talking on these events. So really pleased to join you today to support my colleague from Orpheus, Oliver Fairbank. And he is going to do most of the talking today. You'll be relieved to learn about how the cyber threat landscape is shaping regulatory requirements. Now, this is something which I found as a topic particularly interesting because I've worked in IT my whole life, really, starting with mainframes and working all the way through networks and up to security when security became the cooler thing to do, probably 15, 20 years ago now. And I've worked for banks, and I've worked for financial institutions and public sector and kind of all over the place. And so I've bumped into regulations and regulators quite a lot in that time, whether it's self-inflicted, like compliance with ISO standards, or whether it's because you are a regulated industry. It's something which, of course, we all have to deal with. And so I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, okay, it's a really interesting topic, and how do I think about it, and what do I think about the relationship between regulators and the cybersecurity and cyber threat industry at the landscape at the moment, and how has that changed? And the more I thought about it, and the more I examined my kind of pre-programming about regulation, the more I thought, well, actually, things have really started to change. And so, it definitely used to be the case, I think, in my experience, that regulation changed reasonably slowly, and it was changed in order really to accommodate people who had enough sway with the regulators to enforce changes because it either supported their business model, or because they were able to lobby effectively enough to say, okay, we need to do these things, you're not letting us do them, and in some cases we're just going to go ahead. And that's what I mean by the rules have always changed when bent often enough. And I think, a good example from my earlier part of my career is the use of things like shared resources, shared data centers, shared compute in its very nascent years, very early on. In the financial industry, it was, at the time I was working for a very large bank, and it was a complete no-go. The economies of doing it started to outweigh to be the most important thing to the business. So it just started to happen, and in the end, the regulators, I don't say they gave in, they rethought their model, and they said, okay, well, it looks like this is the future, we're going to have to permit it. But it was a very slow process, and it was driven by the need to save money effectively by the banks. And now I think it is very different, and I think this is what Ollie's going to tell us a lot more about. I think now it's not so much about control. It is about supporting businesses in regulated industries and helping them, particularly with cybersecurity, to stay secure and to have the tools to be secure. It's not about stopping them doing things. It's about helping them to do it safely. And also, I think, it's worth touching on the fact that we've had a massive event in the last couple of years, which has forced a huge amount of change very fast. And I think that's actually probably changed processes as well, and changed approaches, and changed the fluidity with which regulators and the people that are responsible for policy internally and for compliance have had to think, because we had no choice but to send everybody home, and that in most industries, and regardless of what our policy said, what our, in some cases, regulations said, what our customer contracts said about things like running SOCs, we had to find ways to make it work. And, you know, they haven't all gone back to how they were. So I think that model, the model has changed because of that. And it's a good example, I think, of events driving the regulatory frameworks. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm very interested to hear what Ollie is going to say. So Ollie, I'm going to stop sharing because you're probably looking at a letterbox view of my screen anyway, and pass the screen over to you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
For that aid. So hopefully people can see that up on the screen in full screen at the moment.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So cheers for that introduction, Aid. Just in terms of the structure of what I'm going to run through, I'm going to kind of briefly introduce our perspective and fully acknowledge that ours is kind of but one perspective on this issue. And then I'm going to look at, in turn, 3 separate developments in the threat landscape, going back the past 7 or 8 years or so. And for each of those, I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual threat, how that's kind of materialized and developed. I'm going to be looking at the regulatory response, and I'm going to be looking at its impact and how we potentially see those kind of trends in the regulation evolving in the future as well. So just a little bit about our perspective. So I'm the head of analysis at Orpheus. We are a cyber threat intelligence and cyber risk rating company. We advocate, and this will become pretty explicit throughout the presentation if it's not already, is that we strongly advocate a threat-led and risk-based approach to cybersecurity. I think it's captured well in a CREST guide on what is cyber threat intelligence and how it's used, and how is it used, and there's an updated version of that coming out shortly. And just to kind of talk to our perspective on this. So on one side, we are obviously conducting a lot of that research and analysis into the threat landscape, rather than just providing kind of streams of data. We work with Secrutiny often to really try and help our clients understand the threat landscape as it pertains to them, particularly at a strategic level. But also, crucially, we work with a lot of the regulator mandated schemes and effectively help clients navigate the kind of increasing array of requirements that are coming from regulators, and also on occasion help the regulators actually kind of shape and refine some of those schemes and frameworks. So I like to think we've got a pretty good perspective, almost from of both sides of the coin on this sort of topic. I should probably point out that a lot of particularly where I'm talking about the impact of certain schemes and frameworks, a lot of this evidence will be predominantly anecdotal for our experience with the frameworks, how we've kind of seen them evolve over the last few years. I don't have, unfortunately, and this is maybe something when I kind of went looking for evidence that regulators themselves sort of published around maybe some kind of quantitative data sets to attest to the success of their programs. It seemed to be kind of conspicuous by its absence. So it is largely anecdotal, but hopefully provides some insight in any case. So the first kind of threat trend that I want to talk about is this trend. And again, I think it's easy, particularly those who are kind of working the coalface of cybersecurity and threat intelligence. It's easy to almost assume or perceive that the kind of current dominant model of what's occasionally called advanced persistent threats, it's not always been the case. So I've just got a couple of examples of sort of really, I guess, strategically significant cyber breaches and incidents. Obviously, Mandiant's kind of APT1 report was one of the first reports into a state cyber espionage campaign that was explicitly tied to a nation state actor. We've also seen through the years, for example, operations like that conducted by North Korea targeting the SWIFT interbank payment network of Bangladesh Bank, as well as other sophisticated cyber criminal campaigns, such as those from Carbonac and the Butterfly Group. I think, again, because this is the norm now, again, it's important to understand that this hasn't always been the case, and that the kind of current threat landscape, where we are primarily focused on sophisticated threat actors that are looking to achieve persistence on a target network and move towards kind of high value system or information assets, hasn't always been the case. All of these examples have kind of emerged since 2014. That's not to say that the practice didn't exist before, but it's not kind of always been the dominant paradigm within the cyber threat landscape. So what's been the regulatory response? Well, the kind of key one has been the advent of intelligence-led security testing. So the first of this type of scheme was known as SEABEST. Don't ask me what it actually stands for. It's just one of those acronyms that doesn't actually mean anything. I look back to kind of find the initial press release by the Bank of England. It's somewhat understated, that they released in June 2014 around a new framework to test for cyber vulnerabilities. This is actually the idea behind SEABEST, and then this is again a quote from the initial implementation guide, is that rather than just leaving banks on their own to conduct kind of compliance-based or individually asset-focused penetration tests, it was to conduct tests that were guided by intelligence on the TTPs, so the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used by sophisticated kind of real-world threat actors. It was to combine developing those scenarios with an understanding of the bank's people, its processes, its technologies, and its attack surface, to try and simulate attack scenarios and penetration tests that much more closely replicate the sort of attacks they're likely to receive in the real world, rather than that kind of narrow compliance or kind of merely asset focused approach. And I think critically as well, and this is a common theme that touched upon a point that Abe mentioned earlier about providing, I guess, regulated entities with a set of tools. It works the same way for the regulators in this sense, is that crucially, it also provided regulators with a standardized framework and methodology to allow them to compare the kind of differing security standards among regulated entities. So as soon as that methodology is standardized, and these banks, so SEABEST initially applied to the largest 35 or 36 financial institutions in the UK, it allowed the regulators to get a really good perspective on how those different entities compared in terms of their cyber resilience and their ability to detect, mitigate, and respond to some of these more sophisticated attacks. So in terms of the kind of impact and then the potential future evolution of this broader approach of intelligence-led security testing. So again, we've seen, and I've seen from kind of managing a number of the threat intelligence components of these projects over the past 8 or so years, has been the fact that the lessons have been learned from the earlier iterations of SEABEST, and they've been incorporated. So one of the key findings in sort of 2015, 2016 from that initial iteration of SEABEST engagements was just how much information in open source and via passive reconnaissance could be collected around the digital footprint and the attack surface of some of these really large financial institutions. Now, reassuringly, looking at the same bank on its kind of second or even third iteration, or more broadly across the financial sector, we've seen that kind of low-hanging fruit has all but disappeared, and threat actors generally are going to have to work a lot harder in that reconnaissance process to derive that same sort of insight. I think in terms of how the actual schemes themselves have evolved, I think the kind of intelligence-led security testing, kind of as exemplified by SEABEST, is increasingly being seen as the kind of gold standard of that type of approach. I think the success of the schemes has been kind of vindicated by the fact that regulators in different jurisdictions, in different sectors, have increasingly adopted the same approach, albeit with some kind of regional or kind of sectoral twists on it. So these are just a few of the logos from some of those derivative schemes of intelligence-led security testing. So, for example, there's AASE in Singapore, there's TBEST in the UK telecom sector. StarFS is designed for smaller financial services organisations in the UK. There's the Tiber EU and its kind of national derivative schemes, obviously in Europe, as well as the ICAS programme, which is led by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And I think again, going back to that point that Aid meant around regulators developing the tools, I think particularly this is the case with StarFS. The idea is to develop a framework that provides them with access to highly accredited providers in the form of threat intelligence companies or their penetration testing partners, and to provide them with the opportunity to kind of target that gold standard in the form of intelligence-led security testing, and obviously try and enhance their own cyber resilience as a result. And we see in terms of evolution, again, we see further expansion of these schemes is likely. I think that point around accessibility is also going to be a key development in the next few years. So more of these schemes, as they are refined, are likely to be more and more accessible to firms to engage with on a voluntary basis, and gradually with less and less involvement from the regulator side of things. So the second kind of key area of threat and how this is, I guess, translated into regulatory requirements is around supply chain compromises. So again, this is kind of one of the dominant features of the threat landscape at the moment. I know it's kind of very high up the effectively the risk registers, a lot of companies we work with. Again, I think it's important to reiterate that this hasn't always been the dominant model. I think the frequency with which supply chain compromises are occurring has increased significantly in recent years. We've just got some data from our own repository of intelligence reports on the right-hand side that hopefully illustrates that point. And kind of classics of the genre, I think the compromise to SolarWinds Orion was maybe one of the most high-profile ones, but going back a few years, we've seen extensive activity by nation-state groups. So, for example, with the Chinese group Avivor, also with NotPetya, so it was a disruptive Russian operation where Ukrainian accounting software MEDOC was backdoored to great disruptive effect, but also going back to Target, a compromise of Target by a air conditioning subcontractor, which I believe was in 2014. And I think that, again, this kind of tactic wants to preserve a really sophisticated nation states. Is increasingly kind of run-of-the-mill. We see an increasing number of cyber criminal groups, particularly as part of ransomware operations, also looking to conduct this type of operation. So what has been the regulatory response? Again, this particular example was kind of quite financial sector centric. I think It's kind of only logical, obviously, as a kind of relatively heavily regulated sector, and also as a result of that's where a lot of the kind of sharp end of the threat is effectively focused, because of the potential proximity to cash, which obviously it's what cyber criminals are fundamentally interested in. So we've seen a series of requirements by kind of financial authorities in various jurisdictions that are increasingly focused on improving the control environment around outsourced services and third-party risk management. So, for example, as a publication by the PRA there, we see communications from the G7 regarding best practice on managing third-party cyber risk. See communications from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and also at a kind of slightly smaller scale, again in the UK, this is an FCA publication called SEABEST, around which particularly focuses on the requirement of securing third-party providers, understanding and ultimately mitigating risk that arises from the supply chain. So it's something that's kind of increasingly on the regulatory agenda set in the financial services sector, which again is often a kind of portent of what's to come in other industry verticals. So in terms
Oliver,
of,
I'm sorry to disturb you, mate. Can you just waggle your plug on your headset or something? That your sound keeps dropping in and out just slightly. We can still hear you, but you go faint.
Okay, cheers, Martin. I'll maybe hold it here. Hopefully that's a bit clearer.
Yeah, I'm just old school. I think just push the plug in and out again a couple of times. I don't know, but it sounds like a loose connection. Joseph, you're much more technical than me. I might have got that wrong.
I've given it a little tap, so hopefully that's better. But do let me know if it continues to struggle. So in terms of the actual impact of the kind of regulation around supply chain cyber risk. So firstly, it's kind of, we see as part of those intelligence-led security testing engagements, the consideration of the supply chain as a threat vector or as a kind of entry vector into an organization is becoming an increasing consideration. We also see a kind of gradual adoption, and again, this is kind of largely anecdotal, but a kind of shift towards what is established as best practice. So there's a really good publication by the NCSC on the principles of supply chain security, and we see kind of gradual increased adoption of these sorts of principles. I think particularly around the focus on being able to check your arrangements, so points 3 and 4 there, and continuously improve them. I think that's been a really interesting shift and something that's kind of emphasized in some of those kind of regulatory communications, that it's all well and good having a static approach to understanding your key suppliers and potentially the risks that derive from those. But it's often in situations such as a kind of log4shell type vulnerability, or possibly even going back a couple of years, when a situation like the pandemic arises, which completely kind of changes working practices, and introduce kind of new and different types of risks. So I think there's been a lot of improvement in the last couple of years of shifting away from kind of much more static questionnaire-based model, which is kind of done annually, to a sort of a program and a process for supply chain cyber risk that is a lot more dynamic and kind of in keeping with the pace at which the threat landscape moves, and the pace at which kind of vulnerabilities can emerge on a company's infrastructure or with their products even. So the kind of third and final area of I guess area in which the threat landscapes developed and has translated into regulatory requirements is not actually focused on the financial sector. This is actually one that's kind of more in the infrastructure, critical national infrastructure and government sector in the US. So this is around the exploitation of known vulnerabilities, and just a kind of a couple of statistics to introduce this, I guess, this threat to begin with. So there are every year tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in software, firmware, hardware that are discovered by vendors, by software providers, by security researchers, and disclosed and published in the National Vulnerability Database. They are tracked as CVEs, and we tend to use the term CVEs and vulnerabilities interchangeably. However, and these all say 10,000 or 15,000 CVEs a year will typically come with severity ratings, known as the CVSS score. So one of the challenges for organizations is understanding which vulnerabilities that they should focus on. So only a very small portion, so I think 4% in the time the National Vulnerability Database has been running in the last 20 years or so, 4% of total vulnerabilities have actually been recorded as being exploited in the world. So the vast majority of those, although they may exist as vulnerabilities, there is kind of no explicit evidence of their being targeted by cyber criminals or state actors or even cyber activists. And the kind of corollary of that is, even if there is a particular vulnerability or CVE has a high CVSS or severity score, and CVSS will be based on a variety of different factors. For example, the potential outcome of exploiting the vulnerability. So can I, for example, execute code remotely as a result of exploiting a vulnerability? Or perhaps can it only lead to a denial of service condition, which is considered less severe? Because there are a high number of high severity vulnerabilities that haven't been exploited in the wild, there is a challenge for organizations, and I appreciate I'm probably kind of preaching to the choir at this point. There's a challenge for organizations with limited resources to patch and prioritize the patching of vulnerabilities. In an ideal world, you'll be able to patch everything and kind of conduct thorough impact assessments for a potential upgrade to a new version of a particular piece of technology. But the vulnerability management departments in large organizations are typically under-resourced. So it's not always practical, and it means organizations have to focus on those vulnerabilities that are deemed to carry the greatest risk to the organization. So one of the key developments, and I believe this is about 6 to 8 months old, is a catalogue of vulnerabilities that are known to be exploited by threat actors. So this is published by the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So this was an agency set up with the explicit focus of protecting US government departments and elements of critical national infrastructure. So they obviously have really good access and insight into which vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild because of that kind of dual role as a defensive agency, and obviously collaboration with Department of Homeland Security, FBI, NSA, and other government agencies. So they produced a catalogue, and I think the current number of vulnerabilities or CVEs in this catalogue is around 650 currently. And the idea is they've produced this to provide a kind of definitive version on which vulnerabilities they know are being exploited by threat actors. The regulatory requirement applies to those US government departments and also private entities that operate in designated critical national infrastructure sectors. And these CVEs typically when they're published to the catalogue, they come with a deadline for patching. So for example, if a CVE is being reported as being published, organisations might have up to 6 weeks to apply a patch. And if they fail to do that, they have to notify CISA as to the reason for their inability to patch it. In terms of the impact of the CISA list, and I should say, sorry, it does the regulation in this case applies to those specifically regulated government and kind of critical national infrastructure entities. But CISA is pretty transparent. All this information is on their website, and they do encourage other kind of civilian commercial entities to use the list as a resource and as a kind of centralized repository of those CVEs that are subject to targeting by threat actors. So in terms of its impact, I think immediately it's provided a kind of common standard and a reference for threat-led patch prioritization efforts within organizations in a way that wasn't kind of publicly available or consolidated in a single point previously. And again, from anecdotal experience, we know a number of organizations that don't fall under the explicit remit of CISA, but use the CISA list and monitor it closely, apply their own kind of standards and timescales around patching and specifically nominated vulnerabilities that are known to be exploited as well. And it provides also the opportunity to kind of benchmark against that standard, provide the opportunity to report back to senior audiences as well, where there is that kind of nationally or internationally recognized list to compare against. In terms of its the future evolution or potential expansion, I would certainly say that one of the, I think, as I've alluded to there, I think one of the successes of the CISA list has been the fact that it is this consolidated, accessible kind of single source of truth across multiple sectors. Again, also obviously accessible internationally, despite being a US led and kind of US focused product. I would say in terms of the areas of potential expansion, and you know, I completely concede that I think the kind of single nature and the simplicity of the CISA list is part of its appeal. I would say there are opportunities to further enrich the data. So obviously the CISA list naturally has a focus on government agencies and critical national infrastructure entities, although there are obviously commonalities in the vulnerabilities that are exploited across certain sectors. There will be examples where, for example, the financial services sector will suffer exploitation of a different set of vulnerabilities because of particular software they're using or particular categories of threat actors that they face. So there's opportunity for enrichment on a sectoral basis. I would say another feature, or kind of opportunity for enrichment and further segmentation and kind of increasing the potential actionability of this data set is around looking at which different threat actors are exploiting particular vulnerabilities. So, and I know this is from kind of conversations with cyber insurers. This is something that an increasing number of them are looking at, is around looking at the CVEs that ransomware operators are known to exploit, and basically helping their clients focus on those and having conditions around an insurance policy that effectively makes it inactive if a known list of vulnerabilities are found to subsequently appear on that particular insured's estate. And that's the third of the developments I wanted to touch on. So maybe back to you, Martin, or Aid at this stage.
Aid, do you have anything to add at this stage?
No, what I wanted, well, just one thing actually. I say no, and then I do have one thing. And actually, Ollie, you just mentioned it. That's one interesting thing that I think we're seeing, and it sounds like you're seeing as well, that there's kind of a de facto regulation happening, and it's driven by cyber insurers, and that's interesting because it's forcing companies to do things if they want to have the protection from their ransomware policies, for example, that aren't necessarily those things which the same things which the regulators are forcing them to do, but it is de facto regulation, right? Because I think it is. Most people we speak to now consider it a must that they do have some sort of cyber insurance, and they're being forced to make sure certain things are in place, and they've done certain amounts of due diligence on third-party suppliers, etc., which is over and above what they have to comply with. So I think it's an interesting development that actually we're dealing with that driver now as well as the regulatory driver. Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, kind of anecdotal experiences, particularly kind of controls at a high level. So, for example, having, enforcing multi-factor authentication to kind of Windows logins as standard across an organization as a prerequisite for a cyber insurance policy, or, referring to that set of a specific set of vulnerabilities, or maybe a kind of process around attack surface management or threat-led patch prioritization. Yeah, so I think interesting kind of coming at it with a slightly different tool set and different angle to the, I guess, the more kind of formal regulatory environment, or those kind of regulated bodies. But yeah, I think that process is, again, I think it's definitely added value, obviously as part of that cyber insurance procurement process too.
It's been a fascinating discussion. There is an awful lot of regulation. My observations at a higher level than the detail that we've been so fortunate to listen to this morning is that, regulation always follows disaster. No one ever puts regulation in proactively. Regulation is never removed. So it's just like a ratchet. There's more and more regulation, some of which is totally irrelevant to the state of play today. And the biggest problem, of course, is that regulation is what defines activity. And so organizations will comply with legislation and regulation regardless of whether it's any bloody use at all. And that all measurement about performance, both internally, you're not going to win any prizes from your boss if you're not compliant with regulation, and externally, it's all about the regulators checking against the regulations themselves. I don't know what the answer to this is. I mean, regulation is necessary, of course it is. It's useful in many cases, but there's always this thing about, it's always chasing its own tail. It's always there as a standard that you have to achieve regardless. Comments on a postcard, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, all of the major data breaches we've seen in the last few years were from companies who had achieved compliance, right? With regulation.
I always refer back to my old days in the military, where all the great spies in history were the ones that had top level access. What's the bloody point of being a spy unless you've got access? And the regulation itself, what's it achieving, and how useful is it?
But if they can, if there is a sea change from people, and they're actually helping companies to develop their response and their ability to deal with the threat, then that's great, right? If this partnership model is the future.
Yeah,
and I'm not slagging it all off. All I'm saying is that it's far from a perfect beast, and it creates a number of problems as well as solves some.
Well, one thing I would say, Martin, certainly, again, going back to that point around kind of advocating a threat-led and risk-based approach to cybersecurity, I would say, even if we conceive of regulation as a kind of necessary evil, I guess in something I've tried to show with those examples, that if it's actually being informed by the threat landscape, at least that's maybe a step in the right direction. And I would also maybe say, with those three kind of changes or three threats being translated into regulatory impacts, I would say with each of them effectively almost the lead time between the threat being an issue and there being a regulatory response has also kind of seemed to narrow. I don't necessarily kind of advocate or wish for a situation where there's a new kind of threat vector or new model, and suddenly 3 months later we've got something really kind of hastily, poorly thought out, foisted on a lot of companies that obviously have a lot of additional challenges. But I would see that kind of increasing feedback loop and kind of more dynamism as a positive thing, and should hopefully I guess avoid that issue of potential relevance that you mentioned previously as well.
And again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. A lot of it's focused on financial services, obviously, but risks abound in every sector. So that's one other issue that we could explore on another occasion. The one that I really worry about is compliance. And you take something like Cyber Essentials, the uptake. Well, first of all, it's an excellent scheme. And in terms about baseline security, I've no idea why you wouldn't have it. And in fact, even SASE, little old SASE, is about to qualify for Cyber Essentials. But the uptake is pitiful. We're talking a few percentage of organizations. And I guarantee the vast majority of those organizations are the bigger ones that probably need Cyber Essentials less, or at least, are achieving higher levels of security than the SMEs. So it's the uptake of all of these things is just pitiful in general terms. That's a huge frustration. It's there. If it's not mandated, people just don't bother. Comments again on a postcard. Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear if anybody's got any feedback out there, either now or on the LinkedIn post afterwards. It's my job to be the doom monger. and don't get me wrong, fascinating discussion. We've had some lovely feedback and thoroughly enjoyed it. But it is such a minefield is like regulation and legislation, and it causes so much heartache if you're trying to get it, and it causes so much controversy in its wake.
To maybe flip the question back, Martin, from your kind of SASIC's own perspective, what are the, or maybe a kind of more focused on SMEs, what are the major hurdles to engaging with something like Cyber Essentials? Is it just a diversion from what you're doing? Is it the resource?
No, I mean, okay, that's a really good question, and I'm going to speak from the heart here. We're conscious in our industry. We're conscious of cybersecurity, so it's important to me that we're safe, or we're at least taking the basics. It's also important to me that we show an example, and that motivation is I suspect lacking in most organizations because they're simply unaware of the dangers from cyber insecurity and woefully ignorant of the benefits from even just imposing upon themselves a very basic level. And Cyber Essentials is, it's not PhD level. It's elementary. Yeah. So yeah, I think we're a bad example. Our industry is a bad example because, well, even then, not that many people are up there. But at least we're conscious of cybersecurity as an issue in many organizations, especially where they don't have any dedicated cybersecurity individuals or teams. It's the board level downwards are just still don't get it. And
it's a huge problem, and I think there's a huge, again, it's another massive topic, but there's a huge difference between complying with a regulation and living that compliance in your organization every day, right? And I've worked in organizations where, you know, it has been necessary for us to achieve compliance with a regulation in order to win some business. And so you meet the achievement, right? You get the tick in the box, and you know, that organization is by far not the only people that operate like that. You get the tick in the box, and then you move on to the next thing, right? And it's very difficult to make it a living, breathing thing.
And Andy, that's a very good point as well. In many cases, people have only got cyber essentials because they need it in order to get something like government.
Exactly, yeah, exactly my point.